Princeton-Bucharest virtual seminar in early modern philosophy. And this week we have a panel on wonder. And the moderator for the panel is Alex Douglas, and I will turn over the moderation to him.
Okay, thanks so much, Dan, and thank you to everybody for their role in organizing this and to all of you for attending. I'm going to try to keep the transition times brief because we've got a whole panel of speakers this time. So I will just move straight into introducing our first speaker, Daniel Samuel, who is a PhD candidate at the Warburg Institute in London. He previously worked as a medical doctor, and he's interested in the extent to which emotions impact physical health. His current thesis dissertation examines the passions across medical, philosophical, and religious viewpoints in early modern England. And today he's going to speak to us with a paper on the top with the title Before Wonder, Pre-Cartesian Taxonomies of the Passions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. I'll just try and share my screen. Let's hope it works.
Yep.
Is it working?
Yeah.
So it looks good, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alex, and thanks to the organisers for giving us the chance to present some of our work. My talk is entitled Before Wonder, Pre-Cartesian Taxonomies of the Passions. In The Passions of the Soul, published just a few months before his death in 1650, René Descartes stated that there were 6 fundamental passions, namely wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. While the latter 5 were already familiar from established taxonomies of the period, Descartes' inclusion of wonder added a brand new passion to the standard lists. In addition to being placed first amongst the passions, I will argue that wonder stands apart from the others in that it completely, rather than partially, rejects all the basic tenets of what was traditionally understood to constitute a passion. Vernacular treatises on the passions were a genre of text that flourished in the first half of the 17th century, both in England and in France. Here you can see the title pages of 6 of these works printed in London between 1600 and 1650. 3 of these are English translations made from the French within a few years of their initial publication, suggesting a ready market for this type of literature at the time. Many standard features existed within the genre, and one which commonly appeared was a brief definition of the passions in general, normally placed near the beginning of the treatise. The standard definition, which was shared among others, a Jesuit, a Dominican, a Puritan, and an Augustinian, went something like this. A passion is a motion of the sensitive appetite caused by the apprehension of good or evil with a change or alteration in the body. Apologies for the blast of colour in this slide, but I hope it helps make the point. What I will do in the remainder of this paper is go through each of these 3 parts in turn, and then show how the introduction of wonder as a passion entirely subverted this widely accepted definition. The table seen here on the left, produced by Catherine Park and found in the Cambridge History of Renaissance Philosophy, illustrates how the soul was generally understood to function at the beginning of the 17th century across Europe. It was comprised of a collection of faculties that were shared between the vegetative soul, present in plants, animals, and humans, the sensitive soul, present in animals and humans, and the intellective soul, which only humans possessed. Passions were produced by the appetitive faculty of the sensitive soul and could be subdivided into either concupiscible or irascible passions. The frontispiece of the 1649 English translation of Jean-François Sanot's The Use of Passions shows the 6 concupiscible passions, love, hatred, joy, sorrow, desire, and eschewing, and the 5 irascible passions, hope, desire, boldness, fear, and anger, that were first listed by Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, concupiscible passions related directly to good or evil objects, whereas with irascible passions, some kind of obstacle was involved in the relationship. How these 2 types of passions exactly worked was something that was debated throughout the medieval period. A much simpler vision of the passions had been put forward by the Stoics, who instead proposed a fourfold taxonomy. For the Stoics, as described by Cicero in the Tusculan Disputations, a passion arose in the soul after something was judged to be either a present or future good or evil. If an object was considered a present good, an individual would feel pleasure, and if a present evil, then distress. Similarly, if something was considered to be a future good, then desire would result. On the other hand, if it was a future evil, they would be overcome with fear. The four figures on the cover of the 1621 English translation of Nicholas Coeffeteau's A Table of Human Passions allude to this ancient Stoic classification. Philosophers were not the only group interested in the passions in the early modern period. Physicians too were concerned with the passions of the soul, and indeed saw them as one of the 6 non-natural factors alongside air, food, exercise, sleep, and bodily discharge that affected physical health in either beneficial or detrimental ways. Health regimens, one example of which can be seen here, were a popular medical genre which gave advice on how to manage the 6 non-naturals in order to best maintain bodily health. Given that physicians were charged with looking after the health of the body rather than the soul, it's not surprising that they studied the passions from a physiological instead of a psychological viewpoint. On the left is a table adapted from a medical textbook printed in Basel at the end of the 16th century. This other fourfold classification shows how the vital spirits and blood were understood to move around the body when a particular passion was aroused. According to the medical model of the period, joy and anger would inflame the innate heat within the heart and cause the blood and spirits to move towards the periphery of the body. Anger would do this quickly, joy more slowly. Sorrow and fear, on the other hand, would dampen the heat and cause the blood and spirits to return from the periphery back towards the body's center. It is through this account that people could explain why individuals became pale with fear or went red with anger. And so to recap, the standard view found in the treatises on the passions in the first half of the 17th century was that they were motions of the sensitive appetite caused by the apprehension of good or evil with a change or alteration in the body. It is against this background that Descartes offers his own definition of the passions in the Passions of the Soul. In the 27th article, he states that the passions can be defined in general as perceptions or sensations or emotions of the soul, that we refer particularly to the soul itself, and that are caused, sustained, and fortified by some movement of the spirits. The passion of wonder, which Descartes maintains is the first passion of all, not only conforms to this new definition, but also departs from the 3 tenets of the previous tradition, which I've briefly described. The first way in which Descartes breaks from the tradition that preceded him is by rejecting the idea that a passion is a motion of the sensitive appetite. He makes this point clear in Article 68 of the treatise, entitled, "Why this classification of the passions is different from the one generally accepted." He states, "I'm departing here from the opinion of all those who have written about them, the passions, before, for their classification is based on their distinction between 2 appetites in the sensitive part of the soul. As Descartes denied the existence of a sensitive soul and its accompanying appetitive faculties, it follows that passions can no longer be considered motions of the sensitive appetite. It is only with regard to wonder that the second and third parts of the traditional definition of a passion are set aside. For Descartes, wonder arises when an object takes us by surprise and is judged to be new. It is because this happens before we have any knowledge of whether an object is beneficial for us or not, that he considers wonder to be the first passion of all, therefore excluding the second part of the traditional definition. That wonder precedes any judgment about the goodness or badness of an object is restated in a later article, in which Descartes goes on to state that wonder does not cause a change or alteration in the body, as traditionally understood. The article, which is entitled "That there happens no alteration in the heart nor in the blood in this passion," can be seen here in the original English edition from 1650. It reads in full, "And this passion," referring to wonder, "hath this peculiar quality. It is observed not to be attended by any alteration in the heart and the blood as the other passions are, The reason whereof is, that having neither good nor evil as its object, but only the knowledge of the thing admired, it hath no relation to the heart and blood on which depends all the good of the body, but only with the brain, where dwell the organs of the senses subservient to this knowledge. Although Descartes does later describe how wonder can fix the body in a particular state as the animal spirits travel through the nerves directly to the muscles, wonder does not affect the heart or the blood, in contrast to the standard medical view of the time. As for the other 5 fundamental passions and their variants, these arise only when an object is to be judged good or bad, and Descartes goes on to explain that they are felt in the heart purely through the agency of a little nerve that descends to it from the brain. So while the 5 fundamental passions of love, hatred, joy, sorrow, and desire are heartfelt experiences, wonder alone is essentially headfelt. In this paper, I've tried to position Descartes' taxonomy of the passions against the more established classifications of the period. In particular, I've tried to show how his conception of wonder, more than any other passion, rejects the basic tenets of what was generally understood to constitute a passion. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions or comments you may have.
Excellent. Thank you very much to Daniel. Moving straight on now to our next speaker in the panel, which is Gabriella Wyer. Gabby is a PhD candidate at Birkbeck College, London, and she's writing a dissertation about Malebranche. Thank you, Gabby.
Hi, thank you. And thank you to the organisers for having us on as a panel. I just need to try and share my screen as well. Does that work? Yeah, okay. Daniel has already introduced us to the Cartesian passion of wonder, and I'm going to carry on this by focusing on the Malebranchian account. Firstly, though, I want to briefly outline how closely Malebranche follows Descartes in his analysis of this passion. Then I'm going to focus on how Malebranche's approach deviates from Descartes with respect to wonder's uses and dangers. Essentially, I want to say Malebranche is more obviously insistent upon the uses that we have for wonder and more distressingly pessimistic as to its dangers. So it's readily apparent in the search after truth that Malebranche has been deeply influenced by Descartes' understanding of the nature of wonder. Firstly, both understand the perception of novelty to be the cause of wonder. Thus, in the Passions of the Soul, Descartes tells us, when the first encounter with some object surprises us and we judge it to be new or very different from what we knew in the past or what we supposed it was going to be, this makes us wonder and be astonished at it. Likewise, we find Malebranche saying, when we see something for the first time, or when after seeing it several times in a given setting, we see it in a new setting, we are surprised by it and we wonder at it. Further, the two philosophers agree that wonder is a passion unlike the rest. This is primarily because, as Descartes puts it, wonder does not have good or evil as its object, but only knowledge of the thing wondered at. Malebranche agrees. He says, I call this passion imperfect because it is in no way excited by either the idea or the sensation of the good. Whilst the other Malebranchian passions exhibit a complex 7-stage structure, wonder is imperfect because it begins with the movement of the animal spirits and excludes any judgment of its object. Next, the two philosophers agree on the physiological accompaniments of the passion. For Descartes, the body tends to remain motionless in the passion of wonder. Because the new object has not been judged as good or bad, the spirits don't affect the state of the heart or the blood. Instead, they concentrate in the brain, where they preserve an image of the object and flow towards the muscles of the sense organs. Likewise, we find Malebranche telling us, all the spirits move towards the brain in order to trace in it a lively and distinct image of the new object, so that the soul might consider it and recognize it. The rest of the body remains immobile, and there is no emotion in the soul nor movement in the body. Lastly, Descartes identifies the passions of esteem and contempt as species of wonder. These passions begin with wonder, it seems, because they're not simply dispassionate judgments, but passionate assessments of value that affect us on an emotional level. Malebranche similarly finds that esteem and contempt, pride and humility are species of the passion of wonder. So whilst Malebranche and Descartes both identify advantages and disadvantages of wonder, they ultimately have different approaches, I think. In Descartes' view, wonder, when kept well in check, can be a useful study aid, helping us to retain ideas in our memory, but more commonly, it leads to wandering for its own sake and an immobilizing astonishment that prevents the proper acquisition of knowledge. So in Article 76 of the Passions of the Soul, we find him saying, although it is a good thing to be born with some inclination to this passion, since it disposes us to acquire a knowledge of the sciences, we should try subsequently to rid ourselves of it as much as possible. For it is easy to make up for the lack of it by careful reflection and attention, to which our will can always compel our understanding when we judge that the thing we have encountered is worth the trouble. So those lucky enough to be born with an inclination towards wonder should, it seems, use it as a springboard into the sciences, and then perhaps learn to walk free of it. This cannot be Descartes' final word on wonder as a whole, however, for we know that esteem and scorn are species of wonder, and the virtue of generosity consists in esteeming oneself for the right reason. As Descartes tells us in Article 160, the power of the freedom of the will should always give rise to wonder. So I'm going to put the difficult issue of generosity to one side and Descartes' approach to wonder to one side and leave that to Lauren, who's going to talk about Descartes shortly, and focus on Malebranche instead. Malebranche, I think, is more insistent on the uses to which we must put wonder. Our passions, he claims, can be very helpful in the pursuit of truth, so long as we know how to use them. And wonder specifically, when used correctly, is a passion far more suitable for this than the others, because its cerebral nature means that it least affects the heart. Malebranche does not share Descartes' optimism that the useful effects of wonder and attention may simply be replicated by the direction of the will. Without wonder, Malebranche believes, we simply cannot successfully focus our attention. Nothing is more difficult, he tells us, than applying ourselves for a length of time to something that fails to excite wonder. The will might command the animal spirits to represent some idea, but a volition of pure reason, with no accompanying passion, is so weak and languid, he says, that our ideas are more like phantasms that we can barely make out and that quickly disappear. He offers us a physiological explanation for the impotence of pure volitions. These volitions, he says, fail to generate lively motions in the animal spirits. Perceptions of sensible things, on the other hand, cause great motion in the animal spirits, which carve deep traces in the brain. When we try to focus our attention on new ideas, especially non-sensory ideas, the spirits tend to be redirected from the difficult new territory into the already made deep traces, and we find ourselves thinking of old, comfortable thoughts instead. Our attempts at geometry, for instance, turn instead to thoughts of lunch or another coffee. So, contra Descartes, Malebranche believes that no dispassionate assessment that something is worthy of our attention, combined with mere willing, can overcome these habitual patterns of thought. This is problematic because attention is crucial for the attainment of knowledge. As Malebranche explains in the Treatise on Ethics, attention is the occasional cause of God's communication of knowledge to us. Here, Malebranche writes, by a general law which he constantly follows, and all of whose consequences he has foreseen, God has linked the presence of ideas to the mind's paying attention. When we are masters of our attention and make use of it, then without fail light is spread within us, in direct proportion to our effort. Otherwise put, attention is a natural prayer, which is the occasional cause of light. In order to successfully focus our attention, we must utilize the passion of wonder, which applies and illumines the mind, and helps us to overcome the resistance we feel in intellectual pursuits or in thinking out new problems. When we wish to focus the mind's attention, Malebranche advises us to represent the subject we wish to think about in a novel way, so that an impulse of wonder might be excited in us. This wonder helps the body to send ample spirits to the brain, enough to overcome the resistance of the new territories and to restrain the spirits from entering into the usual traces. New traces are carved, which clearly represent the object under consideration to the mind. And when all is well, this wonder should lead to inquisitiveness, and inquisitiveness to knowledge of the truth. At the same time, Malebranche retains many of the worries that Descartes voices. whilst wonder can lead to inquisitiveness, it can also lead to stupefaction and wandering for wandering's sake. Nevertheless, there are two key reasons why he does not suggest that wonder ought to be eliminated. Firstly, because attention is crucial for the acquisition of knowledge, and in our fallen state, we need wonder to aid our ability to pay attention. And secondly, because the passion seems to be an unavoidable one. Wonder is part and parcel of a cluster of passions that reflect our fallen state. Since the fall, human beings have been alienated from God, their true good. Despite this, their wills remain identical to Adam's. The will is an impression from God upon the human mind that leads us towards the good in general. Its ultimate end, the only end with which it can rest, is God. But divorced from God and lost among sensible things, the human will is characterized by restlessness. It is never detained by any particular good, but always remains curious about unknown goods that may offer it the satisfaction it seeks. This natural curiosity, Malebranche says, is good. He tells us, it is consonant with our state, for it is infinitely better to search restlessly after the truth and the good that we do not possess, than to remain in a state of false satisfaction. The new and extraordinary should arouse them, and curiosity should be permitted. So we should be curious about new discoveries, and it is fitting to be excited by wonder. To be excited by novelty. Wonder, which for Malebranche is an imperfect passion, which bypasses the consent of the will, is an unavoidable reaction towards the new and extraordinary. We are compelled to seek out these things for good reason. We cannot and should not cease from looking for new things. Whilst Malebranche might find wonder essential for focusing the attention, he is at the same time deeply concerned about our tendency to wonder at the wrong kinds of things and about the sinful activities that our wonder-derived passions embroil us in. Lacking the true good, the human will is restless and curious, continuously seeking out novel and extraordinary objects which present some promise of stilling the will's anxiety. It is useful that novel objects provoke wonder, provided that great care is taken to prevent it from being followed by other passions. The problem is, Malebranche tells us, that it almost always is. The dependence of the fallen human soul upon the body means that we tend to seek out material objects for consideration, and our wonder for these objects is quickly followed by judgments of value and other passions. Malebranche tells us, should the objects of our wonder appear great, our wonder is always followed by esteem and sometimes veneration. When they appear small, on the other hand, it is always accompanied by scorn and sometimes by disdain. Oops. Our wonder at novel objects is transformed into a judgment of greatness only when the perception of it generates a great deal of motion in the animal spirits. But this is problematic. To make judgments of greatness and smallness dependent on the motions of the animal spirits is to use the body as a yardstick, but the body is biased towards material goods. Malebranche identifies at least two categories of things which are capable of causing great motion in the animal spirits. Firstly, things with a visible grandiosity, and secondly, the rare and exotic. Those things that possess these qualities must naturally appear to us greater, stronger, and more real and more perfect than other things. In short, sensible goods appear to us greater and more solid than those that are not sensed. Thus, with wonder as the starting point, our passions and mechanisms of judgment generate habits and activities that infuriate Malebranche. Astrology, the study of Aristotle, the study of ancient history, obsessions with possessions and riches are, in Malebranche's eyes, the consequence of erroneous judgments of greatness that begin with the neutral passion of wonder. In conclusion, Malebranche appears torn about the passion of wonder. On the one hand, it's an ineradicable part of our passionate nature. It's the right reaction to the curiosity which results from the loss of our true good. But on the other hand, wonder further deepens our fascination with material things and with sinful ways of life, making the reclamation of our true good ever harder to realize. Thank you.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you, Gabby. So continue to focus your attention. We now have Lauren Slater, who is also a PhD candidate at Birkbeck. You might notice a pattern here. She works on early modern philosophy, especially the writings of Descartes. Her dissertation is exploring how Descartes uses the analogy of language to address one dimension of the mind-body problem, namely the question of sensations. So thank you very much, Lauren.
Great, thank you. Is my audio okay? Can you hear me? Good, great. Thank you so much for having us all on. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak about this topic, and I feel like I'm in really good company with the other panel members. So I'm going to speak for a short time on Descartes and the passion of wonder. So the title of my talk is Descartes on Wonder's Stupor. As Gabby kind of mentioned, we get a kind of perhaps a quite negative picture of wonder from Descartes in the Passions of the Soul. But during my little slot, I'd like to explore the scientific relevance of the Passion of Wonder for Descartes. So as Gabby said, when excessive, when wonder is in excess, it paralyzes us and leaves us in this sort of stupor, unable to act in sort of one direction or the other, just this state of astonishment. But when cultivated and when allowed to run its natural course, wonder can lead us to scientific knowledge, which brings with it a kind of intellectual tranquility. So I'd like to suggest that the function of wonder, when it's properly cultivated for Descartes, is to lead us from ignorance towards truth, and therefore a kind of intellectual peace. So I will begin with the Passions of the Soul. A few of these quotes you've heard already, but it's not a bad thing to hear them again. So Descartes in the Passions of the Soul describes wonder as a sudden surprise of the soul, which brings it to consider with attention the objects that seem to it unusual and extraordinary. So Descartes goes on to mention the uses of this passion. In the Passions of the Soul, he says that it strengthens and prolongs thoughts in the soul, which it is good for the soul to preserve, and which otherwise might easily be erased from it. So wonder is particularly useful for Descartes insofar as it makes us learn and retain things in our memory. It sort of spurs us on to consider things, to pay them attention, as Gabby said, and to retain them in our memory. However, just as with all of the other passions, wonder can be dangerous when it becomes excessive or when it is not properly kept in check. So Descartes says that the more often we wonder, we in fact wonder too much rather than too little, and this can lead us to become fixated on things just because they are new to us, and perhaps those things don't actually deserve our focused attention. So we might think here about a collector of curiosities, someone who hunts for items that don't actually deserve to occupy so much of our attention and are only interesting to us because they are new. So Descartes uses some strong words here. He says, although it is good to be born with some inclination to wonder, since it makes us disposed to acquire scientific knowledge, yet after acquiring such knowledge, we must attempt to free ourselves from this inclination as much as possible. So that was the quote on Gabby's slide. I'm glad you saw it there. So we have this quite strong suggestion from Descartes that we ought to try and rid ourselves of wonder as much as possible after acquiring such scientific knowledge. So it's that part that I want to now sort of focus on, the role of wonder in that acquisition of knowledge in the first place. Descartes tells us that we have some use for wonder when we're born. So perhaps we might take from that that we have the most use for it during the first part of our lives when we're doing most of our learning. But then, of course, we have this advice to rid ourselves of it and not let it become excessive. So this has raised a question for me about whether or not there's a point at which we stop acquiring scientific knowledge. So is the recommendation from Descartes that we eradicate wonder, is that a kind of recommendation to stop when we know enough. Since he describes wonder as a disposition to acquire scientific knowledge, is there a point at which we've acquired enough and there's a kind of endpoint there? So that's the question I'm interested in. Does the search for truth have a kind of, have a destination, have an endpoint? So in order to try and answer that question, I'd like to spend the next few minutes just considering one of Descartes' lesser known works, The Search for Truth. So this work is a conversation between three characters, Polyander, Epistemon, and Eudoxus. Epistemon is overwhelmed by the desire for knowledge, and the more he studies, the more his curiosity increases. So his passions, he says, are like a disease. He's never at ease with how much knowledge he has attained, even though he's read all of the books and he knows all of the theories of the schools and so on. So Eudoxus compares this state that Epistemon is suffering to dropsy in the body, which is of course the example that Descartes uses in the Meditations to illustrate that the mechanism of the body can sometimes cause us to behave self-destructively, even though usually it causes us to maintain our health. So if we can run with this analogy and we can compare the excess of curiosity and wonder in Epistemon with this, with the kind of the person who is suffering from dropsy, if we can run with this analogy, then we might take it that Epistemon's passions, which at the moment are causing him harm, they're putting him in this sort of state of distress where he's never at ease with how much he knows. We wonder whether actually when properly regulated, his passions can promote the good that can bring him to a good end. So Eudoxus is our model in this conversation, and Descartes describes him as follows. He says he is a man of moderate intellect, but possessing a judgment which is not corrupted by any false beliefs, and a reason which retains all of the purity of its nature. So interestingly, Eudoxus seems to be enjoying a state of tranquility in contrast to Epistemon's state of unrest. And his state of tranquility seems to stem from his no longer having any passion to acquire new knowledge. So he says, I assure you that I no longer have any passion to learn anything at all. I am as happy with what little knowledge I have as ever Diogenes was in his barrel. And Epistemon remarks to this, I consider you extremely happy, and I am convinced that you must therefore be in possession of knowledge which is far more perfect than that enjoyed by others. So even though Eudoxus doesn't have the inclination to learn anything new, he is not ignorant, and he did not always lack this desire to learn. His current state of tranquility, intellectual tranquility, is the result of his having learned and retained the most important and necessary truths. So that the contents of his thoughts are true and necessary seems to be evident by his affective state. That seems to be what's going on in the conversation, in the search for truth. So his happiness and peace seem to be signaling that in fact the contents of his thoughts are true and necessary. Okay, now I don't think, and I don't want to suggest that Descartes maintains that mental tranquility or satisfaction is always an assurance of true knowledge. But I do think that the satisfaction of a well-ordered intellect is taken to be a sign that the inquirer, the searcher after truth, knows all that there is to know about some particular subject. So the intellect that does not reach such satisfaction and instead is overcome by curiosity and wonder is not only ignorant, as in not sort of properly understanding the matter at hand, but also disordered, just like the person with dropsy. There's something that's gone a bit wrong there. When we achieve knowledge of the fundamental truths, we are content and we cease to be spurred on by wonder. So this is, I suppose, where this is the end of wonder's natural course. We saw from the quote that Gabby shared and that I repeated at the beginning, that there's a point at which we must sort of dispense with wonder. And I'm going to suggest that this is this is the point at which we dispense with it. But that is not to say that it doesn't play a fundamental, indispensable and motivational role in the journey towards truth. So it guides us out of ignorance and leads us to knowledge. And when it is properly employed, it doesn't leave us in a stupor. In fact, it sort of energizes us and it leads us to learning. It spurs us on to seek the truth. However, of course, it comes to an end. The end of its natural course is finding satisfaction in the truths that we have attained. And it's at that point that we achieve this kind of peace of mind, this intellectual tranquility. So for Descartes, I think there does seem to be an end point in the search for truth. And that is signaled to us, again, by a feeling of our intellectual tranquility when we achieve that. So for a well-ordered intellect, wonder is eventually replaced with peace and contentment. And that's all I really want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Great. Well, do not yet rid yourself of the passion of wonder. We have now Steph Marston, who is an associate research fellow at Birkbeck and wrote her doctoral thesis there on Spinoza's political philosophy. And she's going to speak to us with a paper entitled Wonder as an Epistemic Hinge in Spinoza. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to everyone who's put so much work into organising this seminar. I think we're all really pleased to be able to share our different thoughts on wonder in the early modern period, and I'm sure that we'll have some very challenging questions in the second half of the session. So my paper is entitled Wonder as an Epistemic Hinge in Spinoza. And I guess the first thing I need to do is apologize for my potentially misleading use of the term hinge. So just to clarify, this doesn't bear any relation to Wittgenstein's hinge propositions, or if it does, the hinge is on the other side of the door, as it were. It's not that on which all our knowledge claims rely for Spinoza, but rather that which indicates a threat to our knowledge claims and spurs us on to further thought. And next, I should just highlight a couple of my underlying interpretive commitments in looking at wonder in Spinoza's epistemology. So I won't argue for these, but obviously I'm happy to discuss if anyone wanted to raise them in the Q&A. First, I take it that for Spinoza, all knowledge or states of knowing are affective states. So our ideas are always accompanied by some affect, whether the unalloyed joy of the adequate ideas which express our power of acting, or the passive joys and sadnesses which our inadequate ideas bring with them. And second, perhaps less important, I understand Spinoza's epistemology as entailing that the ideas we humans form are always composite ideas involving both adequate and inadequate content. So while Spinoza in part 2 of the Ethics differentiates between reason and imagination, this doesn't entail that they are separate in our thinking. So one consequence of the first commitment is that we're attached to the ideas that we have. At least we're attached to those which are associated with the joy by which we seek to increase our power and persevere in being. And one consequence of the second commitment is that an idea's association with joy and empowerment doesn't guarantee that it is in fact empowering. So a question arises in Spinoza's epistemology as to how a thinker can reconsider or critically evaluate ideas which hold an effective sway over her. And I'm going to argue that the prompt to overcome our effective tie to an idea is the experience of wonder. Wonder interrupts our ability to integrate our experiences into our pre-existing narratives. And in doing so, it alerts us to some inadequacy in those existing narratives and gives scope for reflection and revision. So Spinoza characterizes wonder as forcing us to step outside our habitual thoughts and connections of ideas. He says, and this is part 3 of the Ethics, proposition 5 demonstration, when we suppose that we imagine in an object something singular, which we've never seen before, we're only saying that when the mind considers that object, it has nothing in itself which it is led to consider from considering that. And so it is determined to consider only that. Wonder then marks our encountering something entirely new, such that we can't connect that new experience or object with anything else. Wonder indicates our inability to form an idea of what we encounter, either imaginatively from the common order of nature or through reason by being determined internally. Here we can see why in the definitions of the affects, Spinoza characterizes wonder as a singular imagination. Epistemically, the experience of wonder stands alone. Effectively, wonder is unique in not being a species of joy or sadness, so it doesn't mark a passage to greater or lesser perfection or an increase or decrease in the mind's power of acting. Rather, it stops us in our tracks until we've found some way to make sense of it, to connect it to other ideas. So while Descartes separates out wonder as being purely of the head, Spinoza separates it out as inert with regard to our power to act and think. And like Descartes' association between wonder and stupor, this stalling of our mind could be seen as unproductive or even damaging for progressing our thought. Certainly, the experience of wonder is no guarantee of proceeding to enlightenment or improved understanding. Spinoza's treatment of miracles in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, for example, cites wonder as evidence of ignorance rather than of knowledge. So remaining in a state of wonder may well be in conflict with our ability to improve our understanding. However, that does not preclude wonder from another epistemically productive function, that is, serving as a catalyst for knowing better. And there seem to be a number of routes that this outcome. For example, Spinoza states in the definitions of the affects that devotion associated with wonder can be transformed into simple love by repeated imaginings of the object of wonder. It therefore seems that one way a thinker may overcome a negative state of wonder is by repetition and habituation. The stalling of the mind there is not the end of thought, but a staging post. However, there are also more epistemically engaged ways to make use of our wonder. The fact that wonder marks an interruption to our existing narratives about how things stand in the world also means that it may act as a pivot, maybe that's a better term than hinge, on which a thinker may turn in order to question and revise ideas previously taken as evident. This may, of course, have negative effects too, such as those highlighted in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus of generating superstitions. On the other hand, it may provide occasion to investigate the object of wonder further in order to discover why it represents a challenge to one's existing frame of reference. Since the state of wonder represents an interruption to the existing conceptual frameworks by which a thinker makes sense of her inadequate ideas, it also acts as a strong impetus to find out whether and how apparently anomalous phenomena can be accommodated within those conceptual frameworks. I want to suggest further that the significance of wonder as an epistemic hinge is not confined to such investigation and accommodation of new information. I said at the start of this talk that Spinoza characterizes all our thinking as affective. Affects arise from our forming and making use of ideas in the process of striving to persist in being. Where our efforts are successful, we experience affects indicating joy or an increase in power, and whether or not we experience affects indicating sadness or a decrease in power. In the case of wonder, a thinker's power of acting does not change, but rather pauses. Her existing state of knowledge does not equip her to seek greater empowerment by integrating this new encounter into her existing understanding. Wonder, in other words, may be understood as a challenge to a thinker's standing repertoire of epistemic commitments and responses. And as such, it stands as an imperative for her to make creative use of the ideas she already has, to devise new ways of thinking which can both embrace the object of wonder and account for this challenge to her former understanding. In conclusion, on my reading of Spinoza, wonder as an epistemic hinge has a twofold function. First, it acts as a signal to extend our understanding to accommodate the fact of the existence of things previously unknown. Second, and more significantly, it disrupts our habitual responses such that we're at least potentially able to encounter those things on their own terms, shifting the ways in which we understand the world rather than forcing new encounters into our existing frames of reference. In Spinoza's effective epistemology, wonder is the experience which makes it necessary for us to find new ways to express our power of acting, either by deploying our conceptual frameworks innovatively or by reshaping them altogether. As such, it underpins our capacity for the creative thinking and rethinking necessary for improving our understanding. And that's what I had to say about Spinoza. Thank you.
Lovely. Quite a different perspective there on wonder. And now, finally, to our last speaker. Sorry, hang on one second. Right, sorry. Richard Elliott from Birkbeck again, also a doctoral student working primarily on Nietzsche, but the title of the presentation today is How Wonder Relates to Heidegger's Critique of Cartesian Philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, thanks, Alex. And again, thanks to the organisers of this panel seminar. This paper will be expository rather than taking one side or another in exploring the question of what should be the appropriate relation between wonder and philosophy. I wanted to put that out there before I assume the guise of a Heideggerian lamb descending into a den of Cartesian lions. During the early modern reading group that this panel partly comprises, after a session where I introduced sections 70 to 78 of Descartes' Passions of the Soul, where he discusses wonder, I was surprised to revisit Heidegger's Being and Time for some other purpose, and how much I had previously overlooked Descartes as the target of perhaps the most sustained critique in that work. It is also in Being and Time that Heidegger himself discusses wonder and the relationship it has with philosophy. I will look at this work of Heidegger's and aspects of a lecture series he gives from the late 1930s in this paper. But first, a summary of Descartes, and this is going to be, again, going over some of the material that Lauren and Gabby have mentioned, but I think it's important to say again to frame the later critique that Heidegger gives. Although Descartes is distinctive from Plato and Aristotle in listing wonderment as one of the 6 fundamental passions, he offers a physiological version of the same substantive role for it as these 2 other venerable thinkers. Because it occurs as a kind of antipode to expectation, wonder, the first passion of all, is useful to us and our wider regulation because it makes us more used to rare impressions, in short. We memorize and retain knowledge of new things by wonder, enabling us to notice what is rare. Those devoid of this natural inclination are, quote, ordinarily very ignorant. Descartes cautions against astonishment, qua excess of wonder, as it leads to inertia. The lack of bodily motion it causes means we can, quote, perceive nothing of the object but the aspect of it first presented to us, end quote, which Descartes claims can only ever be bad. There appears to be an identification between this kind of inertia and a disinclination towards reason. And this exposes an ambiguity. Up to this point in the text, the inertia causing excess of wonder, astonishment, was the target. Yet in section 76 of the Passions, Descartes claims that though wonder is useful since it disposes us towards scientific knowledge, quote, we should subsequently try to rid ourselves of it as much as possible, end quote. In other words, things which cause us to experience the passion of astonishment qua excessive wonder are obstacles to robustly philosophical thinking. This is as true for Descartes as it was for Plato and Aristotle before him. Knowledge and habitation with rare and uncommon things is the road to this ridding ourselves of wonder. Whereas the excessive tendency towards wonderment may itself become habitual if we A, apply wonder to the trivial, or B, seek only to marvel at rare experiences rather than understand them. Heidegger casts deep suspicion over the idea that wonder is akin to a form of curiosity prompted by astonishment, as he thinks it is conceived by Descartes and his prestigious cohort, Plato and Aristotle. The first jibe made against this conception comes in Being and Time, where Heidegger offers a blanket critique of, quote, the contemplation that wonders at being only to stop talking about it, end quote. In the late 1930s, Heidegger develops a more nuanced, positive conception of wonder, dedicating a series of lectures to a more systematic discussion of wonder. There, Heidegger challenges conceptions of wonder that see it as, one, a kind of philosophical muddle that one needs to end. Overcoming wonder is the goal for Descartes as much as Plato and Aristotle. And two, the presuppositions motivating the wish to overcome wonder, Descartes' fruits at the end of scientific or intellectual inquiry that were initially spurred on by wonder, are captured in the language of novelty, rarity, preservation, and a relation of power. I have conquered the object that risked leading me into passional or intellectual inertia. The problem with this conception is underpinned by what are, to Heidegger's mind, a series of erroneous presuppositions about how one might frame one's relations, practical as much as intellectual, towards the world, of which Cartesianism is described as being the, quote, most extreme development of. Heidegger criticizes Descartes' conception of the world in the context of a long section in Being and Time on space and spatiality. I haven't the time to offer an exhaustive exegesis of this section here, save for to note that Heidegger's own positive conception of wonder fits astonishingly well with what he says there about space and extension in the context of repudiating Descartes in Being and Time. Spatiality appears to us as an, quote, inconspicuous familiarity, a description very similar to the tones he uses to talk about authentic wonder in the 1930s. Wonder constitutes, or perhaps better put, wonder stimulates, quote, the ground of necessity for primordial questioning. So far, this sounds a bit like Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes. But whereas traditionally, certain epistemic concepts were applied towards objects of representation as a means of overcoming wonder, Heidegger sees this as a faulty premise already loaded with metaphysical presuppositions. Apply this to Descartes, for example. God is viewed as a self-constituting substance, and self-evidence as the gold standard for inquiry. This is, of course, not limited to Descartes. Heidegger's contention is that metaphysics more broadly has historically been unable to think its own condition of possibility. But Descartes neatly fits with Heidegger's claim that metaphysical speculation is guilty of, quote, limping behind a being, end quote. In the case of Descartes, it is a conception of being as substance that renders itself amenable to static and apparently institutionalizable knowledge of it. This brings up an important difference between the two. As Nassim Norouzi writes in a piece from the Slim Literature on Heidegger and wonder, Descartes might be characterized as seeing wonder as, quote, a prelude to more certain knowledge, end quote. By contrast, Heidegger, on the other hand, situates wonder as in some sense a stimulus to thinking, but not in the manner that it motivates itself to be overcome. Rather, wonder acts as a mode of distress, to be sure, but one that recognizes the human predicament between the wholly familiar and the uneasiness about the manner, which no matter which conceptual apparatus we bring to characterize the objects of the world, we never wholly grasp it for all time beyond our own temporal historical situation, what he elsewhere calls the projection or horizon of being, as it is for us. Indeed, such an attempt to overcome wonder would ignore the perpetual interplay between the practical reality of the world we inhabit and the wondrous thought that such a world and its beings are at all, and yet cannot be while this fundamental thought remains overlooked by metaphysical reflection. Metaphysics occludes being for Heidegger, while authentic wonder is, to employ an apposite phrase Heidegger uses elsewhere, that which stimulates, quote, a modified grasp of everydayness. There is also a more parochial element to Heidegger's conception of wonder. He wholly rejects the kind of wonder as curiosity towards novelty, which arguably Descartes postulates on three conditions. Curiosity distracts itself with what is new, to the detriment of what is nearest and most familiar as a source of its own kind of knowledge, and also resists a, quote, dwelling, that is, a practical sphere of reference which for Heidegger governs all our relations with the world, and which he would argue the Cartesian couldn't do without, even in the pursuit of rejecting all that isn't clear and distinct about that world. In opposition to curiosity, as mentioned, wonder is a particular sense directed about what is unusual about what appears to us as most usual, the sense that beings, objects of the world, appear to us in the manner that they do. The Cartesian might answer that this is actually more resonant with Descartes' starting point than Heidegger might wish to concede. But Heidegger rejects the Cartesian apparatus as an appropriate one to claim such an affinity. Heidegger also claims that the proper relation to wonder is not to overcome or dominate it by means of controlling our epistemic relations with the world, as in Descartes' case, by means of ascertaining clear and distinct and scientific knowledge. Rather than seeking to master this unknown quality, it, quote, turns back to the usual in somewhat cryptic Heideggerese for an immersive but non-dominating relation of wonder with it. Now, what the heck this cryptic relation might look like, with all its potentially idealistic, theological, intellectually quietistic, and ethical implications, is something that has dominated my wider thinking about Heidegger, yet remains a topic I need help with, which may make it a good topic for the Q&A. But Heidegger is motivated to argue that the idea of wonder that aims at explaining everything away by virtue of its overcoming is not only metaphysically erroneous in its possibility, but also somehow damaging to our authentic relations with the world. And just to conclude, this section is called Descartes' second kind of wonder, a horizon of knowledge. All of what I've said about Heidegger is no doubt contentious, but hopefully to some extent stimulating for the audience here. But I'd like to conclude on a slightly different note that might see Descartes coming closer to Heidegger's conception of wonder as itself not something to be overcome and eliminated, but rather itself a kind of intellectual reward, or at least proper attunement with the world. I'd like to offer the suggestion that perhaps Descartes offers one other candidate or conception of wonder, one that is less explicit than the taxonomized physiological passion called wonder that he bestows the status of a fundamental passion. This implicit conception comes at the conclusion of the third meditation. Before inquiring into the possibility of epistemic falsehood in light of the impossibility of God's deceiving him, Descartes pauses, quote, for a time in contemplation of this all-perfect God, to ponder at leisure his marvelous attributes, to consider, admire, and adore the incomparable beauty of this immense light, as far, at least, as the strength of my mind, which is, so to speak, dazzled by it, will permit. Now, the term wonder is not used here, but what is this kind of state if not a form of wonder? It is also not a form of wonder that is to be overcome, in spite of, or perhaps even because of, the limitations of the mental capacities which Descartes concedes as limitedly grasping God. My concluding speculation, then, is whether Descartes tacitly offers a different kind of wonder here, unnamed as such, but one which the Cartesian inquirer does not seek to overcome, but rather grapples with as a residual stimulus to further knowing. Indeed, perhaps, despite the evident conflicts in their presuppositions for what fundamental inquiring is, if this is a form of wonder, it is of a kind to some degree similar to Heidegger's own conception. This is because, like Heidegger's, quote, this is Heidegger now, quote, does not seek to possess, but to let being be. Wonder will belong to Sophia as the beginning of philosophy, as not just a beginning that is left behind, it remains its guide and ground, end quote. This might be an erroneous feeling or a sense of inauthentic wonder by Heidegger's lights. Perhaps this is since Descartes, for Heidegger, can only feel this form of wonder by means of an epistemic achievement of concrete knowledge acquired by an ambit of reason, which he thinks is littered with ontic or ontological presuppositions. Or can it be Descartes affirming something which involves acknowledging the frailty and limitation of this kind of epistemic achievement? Is it more akin to that remark attributed to Heraclitus, the one valorized by Heidegger, that even in the bread kitchen, the gods are here? And thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to the whole panel. Fascinating discussion. I'm ready to move to questions now. I get there's no hand raising tool as far as I can see, but you'll have to use your biological hand raising tool, or I guess if your camera's not switched on, use the thumbs up or something. But I'll just take questions as I see them. So I see one now from Daniel Cook. You're muted. Still muted.
Yeah, I enjoyed all the papers, and this is directed partly to Ms. Wyer's paper, but I was wondering about the specific use of aesthetic. Now, I know that term didn't become really popular till the 18th century, but it was interesting that she showed works of art, and I'm wondering if there was any attachment or use of the term wonder to works of art. And also, I was wondering another object, of course, when we think of Kant as sublime, whether there was specific reference for Kant as to the powers of nature, if I recall, and whether this was connected in any way. And finally, the term awe is often used, whether these terms existed. My French is good, but not that good, and my Latin also. So I was just wondering about the use of the paintings, Ms. Wyer, and whether there was any wonder attributed to them as an object.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for your question. I guess in a way, the inclusion of the paintings was sort of like me using the same trick that Malebranche is suggesting. So trying to get the audience to pay more attention to what I'm saying by including interesting images that might make them focus their attention. But at the same time, I think he would also have thought that paintings were objects of wonder. I think objects to be collected, and that there were also lots of, I think, paintings in the period of sort of cabinets of curiosities and sort of curious objects that showed that people thought these should be sort of topics for art. I'm less sure about the powers of nature part and the kind of awe part. I guess, although wonder is supposedly neutral initially for Malebranche, when you judge something to be great, he thinks it leads you to esteem it and to venerate it, which I guess is a form of awe for him. That's kind of just the reaction that he would think we have to the objects of wonder that we think are great. So I guess wonder doesn't automatically involve awe, but when it comes with the right judgments, then it would lead to awe, I think.
Is there any reference to religious wonder, or is usually used in that term, or as well?
I think in a way, Yes. So I think one of the examples that he uses of tricking us into paying attention to kind of ideas and truth rather than sensible objects is in particular sort of like the word made flesh, so the coming of Jesus. He uses that as a sort of concrete instance of how something that was previously just a wisdom that was sort of inaccessible to us because it was nonsensible was made available to us through a sensible form. So I think, yeah, he does think that it has sort of religious applications. I'm unsure to what extent, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a few questions coming in on the chat. One from William Eaton, which I'll read out. So primarily for Lauren and Daniel. What about wonder of the infinite nature of God? We can never fully understand it, but awe seems to be an appropriate reaction and appreciative of the divine nature rather than disordered. So why would Descartes want to be rid of it? You can decide.
Who wants to
Lauren.
go first? All right. Thanks, William, for that question. Yeah, I think God is a really interesting example. Obviously, yeah, for Descartes. I thought it was nice that Richard included that part from the end of the third meditation about sort of wondering at God, or sort of having that moment of reflection on God's great nature. And certainly I think that's one of the most religious moments in the meditations, that moment where he stops to try and contemplate the God. Sorry, no other way to say it. I suppose that for Descartes, perhaps it wouldn't, that feeling, although God is sort of, well, we have this, I think the idea of God is an interesting one, because in this one sense we have a clear and distinct idea of God. Descartes tells us that we can have a clear and distinct idea of God, and in the other, there's another sort of part of that, which is that we can't fully grasp God. So there does seem to be,
especially in his reply to like Gassendi.
Sorry.
Especially in like his reply to Gassendi and so on.
Mm-hmm. So we have this perhaps a kind of tension, or at least something. There's something interesting there. The idea that we can have this clear and distinct idea of God, but also not fully grasp God. I suppose that sort of reaching out and touching, or that sort of intellectual reaching for God, perhaps that's not quite wonder, I suppose, is my intuition, but I'm not committed to that. It is something that I will think about. So thank you for your question. I don't know if Daniel has it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. It was great.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks for the question. I've been working mostly on the treatises on the passions up to 1650. So wonder as a distinct passion doesn't really feature in those, as far as I've been able to tell. But obviously that doesn't mean that God doesn't feature. I think in the preface to Descartes, he writes that he's writing his own treatise, not as a rhetorician or as a moral philosopher, but comme physicien, so as a natural philosopher, I guess. And the passion treatises up to him, more than works of moral philosophy, they seem to be mostly works of moral theology. And in the frontispiece, the Ceno, where you saw the 11 passions from Aquinas, you saw the passions being controlled by reason in her throne, which is a trope which comes up in many of these treatises. But above reason, with Ceno, you've got divine grace, and really it's divine grace that's really key in managing the passions. And so, God features through this way, that, he's there managing the passions and trying to help with the development of virtue and ultimately salvation. But to speak specifically to your question as wonder of God as a passion, I haven't seen it yet in those treatises up to 1650.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that by the passions, he's up to a whole different project. But thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
Pleasure.
Very enlightening.
Thank you. There's a bit of a queue forming, but Emanuele sent me a question earlier for Steph, which he asked me to read out. Do you think that wonder, as well as grounding miracles, similarly grounds the extraordinary capacity for imagination that characterizes prophets?
That characterizes what, sorry?
Prophets.
Prophets. Well, I suppose I'd have to say I'm not sure. So when Spinoza talks about wonder in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, it's more about the people in whom superstition is generated than it is about, I mean, I guess, you know, the pronouncements of the prophets kind of, they walk a line in a way between what generates wonder and what doesn't, because one characteristic of the things that the prophets say is that they are accommodated to the understanding of the people that who are being prophesied to, as it were. But I guess if they weren't met with some element of some degree of wonder, then they wouldn't count as prophecies. They'd just be ordinary pronouncements. So I think, I mean, I haven't looked into it, but it seems possible that, you know, that there's some quite complex underpinning kind of social epistemic mechanism going on in the case of prophecy, and what's required for these ideas to count as prophecy, to become recognized as prophecy in the context to which they are directed. But whether that is wonder which is conveyed from the imaginations of the prophets themselves, I think might be a bit more tricky.
Thank you. Question. I think Dan Garber has a question for Daniel and Steph.
Thank you very much all for a wonderful group of talks and bringing up some wonderful issues. But I have a question that's directed in part toward Steph Marston and in part toward Daniel Samuel it begins about Spinoza and about the difficulties I find in comparing Descartes and Spinoza on the passions. Well, Spinoza's term, of course, is not passion, but it's affect, which in a certain sense indicates, I think, a different framework, a very different framework from what it is that Spinoza is working on. I mean, what Spinoza says, of course, is that joy, sadness, and desire is the same as appetite and will for Spinoza. But he says, and this is the demonstration of proposition 57 of part 3, joy and sadness are the desire or appetite itself, insofar as it's increased or diminished, aided or restrained by external causes. So fundamental to Spinoza's conception of the affects, the emotions, is appetite. They're all, in one way or another, varieties of appetite. And so it's not surprising in a certain way when he does say in the appendix to Ethics 3 that strictly speaking, wonder is not one of the affects, and that he's including it there only because it's at that point typical to include it there. And I think he has in mind, of course, Descartes and sort of later people reacting to the passions of the soul. But no, I'm wondering whether or not, well, in general, and over the question of wonder, whether it's really possible to put Descartes and Spinoza to really compare them on this, because their conception of the emotions or the affects are so different from one another, which leads me back to Samuel's talk, Daniel Samuel's talk, excuse me. And what you were characterizing is the sort of pre-Cartesian conception of the emotions, which it looked to me pretty much the Aristotelian tradition going back to St. Thomas, where the passions, the emotions are, as you put it, motion of the sensitive appetite. In a certain way, I think that's exactly what it is that one finds in Spinoza's conception of the affects as well, insofar as all of the affects are, in one way or another, modifications of what he calls appetite, which is obviously connected with a sensitive appetite in earlier people.
Can I respond to you now, Daniel?
Beg your pardon?
Have you finished? Sorry.
Oh, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I guess with the question of vocabulary and passion and affect, and I suppose the Latin correlates, I know that there is a distinction in the stuff before 1650 of passions being motions of the sensitive appetite, but there is also discussion of these feelings, let's call them, being motions of the rational appetite or the will.
Yep.
And there's in the treatises between 1600 and 1650, you see different ways of approaching this. So some people just use those terms interchangeably, whether it's passion or affection or perturbation, which is Cicero's word.
Yeah.
Some are more technical. Some try to keep passion for motions of the sensitive appetite. Some try to keep affection for motions of the rational appetite, the will. And so I guess that's what I'm seeing. When it comes to Spinoza, I'm thoroughly uneducated, so I'll leave that to Steph to respond to.
I think what Dennis actually just made a comment here, asking about how stable the vocabulary is. Specifically, he was asking about admiration, which is a good admiration or wonder, which is a good question. But I think that part of your point, Daniel, is that the vocabulary for this sort of category of mental event, taken very broadly, is not stable at this point.
Yeah, and in that first 1650 edition of Descartes, the word wonder doesn't turn up really. It's admiration. So the 6 fundamental passions are admiration, love.
Well, admiration is the French word,
yeah,
and translated as wonder.
Yeah.
But the thing is, but Descartes is quite clear. He is talking about passion as opposed to action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's right in the very beginning, but of course, affectus is another word that's used. Affect, which is what Spinoza uses, uses that. For example, in the De Homine.
Yeah.
But also perturbatio, as you suggested. It really is, or emotio. There isn't a really stable vocabulary.
Yeah. And this idea of a passion being passive, I guess, it's complex, because it seems that when it comes to the different faculties, when something is, say, an object in the world, goes to the senses, and the common sense is passed on to the imagination, it seems the imagination then presents it to the sensitive appetite, and the sensitive appetite responds in a sense. And so in a sense, it's passive insofar as the imagination presents something, and the sensitive appetite has nothing but to respond in a certain manner. And in a sense, I think the word is hormetic. It's kind of this action initiating impulse. There is this kind of active aspect to the passion, which is meant to be passive. So it is very confusing. But so I think there are passive and active elements to a passion. And
in Spinoza, the word is affectus,
Mm.
there are passive affects and active affects, which is why passion does not really work at all for Spinoza. But Steph, I was curious your reaction.
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Dan. I think probably it's useful to remind ourselves that when these philosophers talk about one set of emotional phenomena, they are talking about them in really different ways. And I think in ways Descartes' Passions of the Soul has the, although it's very much grounded in his broader philosophy, it has the tone of a kind of, well, how do we manage the passions? Whereas, you know, when Spinoza talks about the affects in the third book of the Ethics, it seems to be like far more of a descriptive project. And as you said, Daniel, the affects may be active or passive. It seems far more as if at that point Spinoza's seeking to account for some psychological phenomena in a kind of in a reductive way, taking things down to joy, sadness, and desire. I guess I was interested in something that you said, Dan, which was why that it's not surprising that for Spinoza, wonder's not, strictly speaking, an affect, because affects are manifestations of appetite. And I just thought, well, it seems like wonder could easily be a manifestation of appetite. It's a manifestation of our appetite to explore further and discover new things. So I guess I wasn't entirely persuaded by that, but I think it's right that it's I mean, when we compare these philosophers and the ways that they write about passions or affects, or in this case, wonder, we do need to bear in mind that what they're writing is embedded into really different kinds of projects. So thanks for that question.
Thank you both.
Great. Okay, there are some questions in the chat. There's one from Michael Descartes and one from Lisa Shapiro. I mean, I guess you can read these for yourselves. Or
I was just wondering if any of the speakers wanted to speak to the correspondence and discussion of Passion of Wonder with respect to Descartes' correspondence with Elizabeth of Bohemia. Does anyone want to speak to
that? I can read your question, I think, so I'm just having a little look at it now. I don't think I know enough about this to give you a kind of firm answer. But I will say that I suppose it sort of seems to me like Descartes' passion in Descartes' Passions of the Soul, he seems to be much more interested in describing the workings of the body at that point than he does really about the passions and emotions. Also, it seems to me the first part of the book is very heavy on the kind of what we would now just call science of physiology. I think that's obviously something that he's very concerned with himself, I think, but I don't really have anything more to say than that. I don't know if that is interesting at all.
There is one thing which I'll just mention. I think with all the passion treatises I showed at the beginning, there's one by Edward Reynolds from 1640. And I think, I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think that one is dedicated to Elizabeth of Bohemia. So it seems that at this time, she's already thinking about this, and maybe she was wholly unsatisfied by Reynolds's version, which is why she wanted a new model. But I guess she's an interesting character in that she is looking at both the old kind of paradigm as well as the new.
Gabby, did you want to say something on this, or was it just?
No, I don't think I will, because I don't really have the familiarity with those texts.
Yeah, it's a good thing for people to look up. All right, could we move to Lisa Shapiro's question, I guess, before we get too far away from this topic? You can see it in the chat there, or I don't know if Lisa, you would like to.
Sure, I'll just be quick about it. This was sort of just building on William Eaton's question that was focused on the wonder at the divine. But I was just wondering what the limitations. I found, first of all, thanks to all of you for your papers. It's a really lovely session. Lots of interesting questions. But I wanted to hone in on Lauren, your paper and the limitation, really about the limitations of this end of the search for truth that you were arguing for in Descartes and the piece. And I guess what I wanted, the question's really about the different objects of scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the divine on one hand, but then there's also knowledge of particular things. And so you might think that we do reach a conclusion to our investigations into the properties or the natures of particular things. But that's different from knowing about everything. And that might not end. Our attempt to know about nature might not have an end. And in the other direction, the self-knowledge, whether there can be a limitation to our wonder at ourselves, or finding out about it, whether we're ever, maybe the way to put it in standard Cartesian terms is whether we're ever fully transparent to ourselves. So just inviting you really to say a little bit more about the boundaries of your thesis there.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a really wonderful question, or a really wonderful few questions that I saw in the chat. So thank you. In terms of what I think scientific knowledge is, I suppose in the search for truth, they are discussing kind of the sort of the big hitters from the meditations, the kind of truths that are landed upon about reality and about God. I suppose I think of it quite broadly about the things that we can know about the nature of reality. So in that sense, it does seem like there's a lot that we could possibly know about, but I suppose the kind of core fundamental principles, I think, Descartes thinks that we can't grasp those. And so I suppose I took it that was what he was thinking about, that we don't need to have knowledge of absolutely everything as long as we have knowledge of the fundamentals, the kind of true things that we can know about the nature of reality at the very kind of core. But self-knowledge, I think, is a harder topic for Descartes, mostly because it depends on what we're thinking. I suppose it depends on how we're thinking about the self. So the self as an intellect, I suppose, to know our own minds in as far as they are pure minds, is something that we might pursue by reflecting on our ideas and spending time sort of contemplating and reflecting on our ideas, clear and distinct ideas of the intellect. But whether or not that's sort of really what we mean when we think about ourselves well, it doesn't seem right to me. And I don't think it really seems right to Descartes as well. I think, for Descartes, we are embodied minds. And so I suppose the thinking about ourselves as human beings, as mind-body compounds, is more difficult, and it's going to be knowledge of a different kind for Descartes, I think. It's going to be unlike our knowledge of these fundamental truths of nature. I think it's going to be, we know ourselves as embodied beings in a completely different way, and we experience ourselves, through the senses and the passions, and I think that's a different kind of self-knowing. Your mention of generosity is interesting. I have thought about this because I suppose that could be, that could have something to do, I don't have this thought worked out at all, but I think that could have something to do with knowing ourselves as human beings. It's something about knowing that we are, knowing that we have control over our will, and knowing that we're sort of in the world in a certain way and striving towards the good. I think that does sort of bring together, I think it is sort of body involving, as a kind of, I suppose, a sort of virtue that we cultivate as human beings. And so I think that kind of self, I think, yeah, generosity does relate to that kind of tranquility, but perhaps it's in a slightly different way. I think the kind of intellectual tranquility is supposed to come from contemplation of these clear and distinct ideas, these sort of fundamental truths, whereas generosity is a kind of settlement in the self or something like that. But as I say, I don't think I have the thought fully worked out. But I do think there'll be different kinds of knowledge that we can attain, and perhaps different kinds of perhaps different sort of endpoints, but maybe the endpoints are much less clear when it comes to knowledge of the self as a human being. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yeah. Also, just noting the connection that Lisa made with Spinoza on the love of God. Very interesting. Yeah, the acquiescence of mind that's supposed to come with a particular type of knowledge. I think Andrew Chignell had a question that was a follow-up to this.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm sorry, I'm on my phone, so it's a bit awkward, but I really enjoyed the discussion. I guess I just wanted to clarify something related to Richard's paper and the talk about God, but not so much in a theological context. So is it possible for there to be, I mean, Lauren said she works on sensation in Descartes, and you might think that at some point investigation runs out. And so this is also in some sense a follow-up on Lisa's question. We get to the point where we have to say something about a natural signification system between mind and brain that might be set up by God or nature, but there's just not much more to say. And so it would feel strange to me to think that you encounter one of those ends of inquiry in a natural context and don't still feel a kind of wonder about the system and the way it's set up. So I guess the question is, even outside of the theological context, can we run up against the bounds of our knowledge in Descartes and not feel bad about it, but still encounter it as a kind of wondrous thing?
Richard, did you want to?
So that could be for Lauren or for Gabby, I guess.
Right.
Taking it out of the theological context that Richard was discussing and wondering if there's a place for wonder at the end of inquiry in a natural scientific context.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think from Malebranche's perspective, he doesn't think that we would manage to reach the end of wonder in general, just because there's this kind of restlessness of the will that he talks about, which means we're never satisfied by any particular object that our wonder focuses on. So I think he would have quite a different perspective to the kind of perspective Lauren was suggesting Descartes might have. So I think maybe he kind of is a bit outside of that. Yeah.
So he would never recognize that there are places in natural inquiry where we just run up against bounds that seem unsurpassable.
No, oh, sorry, yeah. I think he would recognize that, but he would always think that there's another object that you could move on to. There would never be sort of an end to sort of wondrous searching, I think.
I see, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose the picture that it seems like we get in the search for truth is that actually to be in that kind of dissatisfied state is actually quite unpleasant.
Yeah.
So I suppose Descartes, well, it seems like perhaps Descartes is suggesting that we needn't we needn't know everything, but it's sort of about I was going to say quality, not quantity. Maybe that's too simple a thing to say. But I suppose he thinks, yes, that that when we come to kind of understand these fundamental things about reality, that we can sort of direct our attention to them, reflect on them, and that's sort of a peaceful and tranquil thing rather than this kind of I suppose this sort of spurring to always find the next thing. But I don't think the tranquility necessarily means that we're not sort of impressed, or that we're not interested, and that we have a sort of a positive feeling towards the truths that we're reflecting on, I suppose. So it's not that it's sort of devoid of interest or anything like that.
Okay, so it just wouldn't be wonder in the technical sense at that point.
Yeah, I suppose it wouldn't be wonder in that it wouldn't be this sort of thing that we're looking at because it's a new thing. In the sense that Descartes means it, I think. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a thought on this actually because I've been working on beatitude, but there's this Augustinian, well, Thomistic as well, argument that beatitude, if it's the object of your desire, then it has to be something that you has to be. Oh, sorry, something's gone weird here. It can't leave anything to be still desired, or it's not really the object of your desire. It strikes me as the same sort of thing going on with knowledge here, that if knowledge is the aim of the object of your desire, then it can't leave you with the desire for further knowledge, because then it's not the ultimate object. I don't know. But Richard, did you have a thought on this as well?
Only insofar as I think it's a very interesting prospect to think about the idea, what is Descartes doing in the third and fourth meditation in particular? And there's a question of remit. So in regards to intellectual or scientific inquiry, I'll speculate again, as I did in the paper, there's the question about whether all these kinds of epistemic facilitations are grounded in some sense by God. In which case, maybe you could make the inference that all knowledge can be imbued with the kind of wonder that I'm speculating is directed at God at the end of the third meditation. That's just an off-the-cuff reply, but I think it's consonant with what Lauren said as well. I hope.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Great. So there was a question from Dennis about just the stability of the vocabulary. Now, there's been some discussion of this in the chat, but I don't know if you'd like to bring this question live.
Sure, I believe Dan also referred to part of it, so it might be in part out in the discussion here as well. But what I want to at least point out was, through two examples, is I wonder whether wonder, admiration, stupor, these are all words for the same thing in English at the time, or translations of this in French and Latin at the time, or in Dutch. But there people are discussing the exact same thing and then they're having different theories about that thing, the one thing that they're discussing. Or there are the different emotions that become central to their theories, and others do not appear in them. So in Hobbes defines admiration explicitly in Leviathan. Later on, he uses the word wonder, and it's in the conjunction admiration and wonder, and this is with respect to, it comes in the chapter on miracles. One might consider whether he just takes wonder to be admiration, or one can say, well, wonder, he didn't really bother to define wonder. It can be too different from admiration, but it would have some additional component, perhaps something like profound appreciation, as Willie Meaton said. But it just not clear from, it's not defined, so it's not evident that that's what he would take wonder to be. That's in English. So in Spinoza, you have, Spinoza defines admiratio in Ethics 3 and in its appendix. Now, earlier he wrote the short treatise. The short treatise discusses, it's in Dutch, and he uses a word for wonder. I have no idea how to pronounce that in Dutch, but wondering. I think it comes in a discussion of passions, which it basically takes Descartes' division of the passions and translates it, the terms into Dutch and discusses them there. Now, passion, there he used a word called liefling or something pronounced along those lines in Dutch. But clearly what he's done is taken over Descartes' division of the passions and defined this passion along the lines that Descartes does. Now, one thing that Dan mentioned was that there is a difference between Spinoza understanding of affectus and Descartes on passion. And this could be a theoretical difference within, and fitting various terms into these could be problematic. The same phenomenon might not fit in quite the same way. It doesn't to Descartes as it would in Spinoza. So even within Spinoza, the change from the Dutch to the Latin in the ethics could be a difference that is part of a bigger difference in theory rather than just a verb, a change of a translation of one word with another, verwondering in place of admiratio. So, and these are just two examples, Hobbes and Spinoza, and it's just looking at it, it's not exactly clear that they're all defined, they are talking about the exact same thing by using these various terms. And when you look at Malebranche and others, perhaps this the plurality of those terms might make us question the stability of the vocabulary with which these people discuss one phenomenon or discuss different phenomena. So what I want to ask is, how should we take these terms to be interchangeable for these people? Just one translating the other in Latin, French, English, or should we take them to talk about somewhat different things, even though related things? I didn't say who I'm asking to, but since this is a more general question about, maybe it relates more to Spinoza, since I gave the example of Spinoza, it would be better in respect to discuss
So
that.
I'm happy to say something about this. I mean, I think it's absolutely right to say that, I mean, there are significant developments and shifts in Spinoza's philosophy between the short treatise and the ethics. That's definitely true. And as we previously discussed and people have said on the chat, I mean, there are instabilities in the vocabulary, but I guess my feeling is that it's important not to get into a state where we magnify those differences too much, partly because although people in the early modern period, they're developing their own take on these concepts. They're also in at least abstract or intellectual conversation with each other. There's an intention there to speak about the same thing. And what we might want to interrogate is, well, is the same thing the phenomenon of like everyday emotion, or is it something deeper than that? So that I think there's a real question to be asked about whether in effect they're theorizing the same thing. But it does seem fair to say that they're interested in the way in which their different ways of thinking interact. So I would say that where there's some stability in vocabulary, and it's clearly not entirely stable, then it's of interest to us in looking at the history of philosophy to understand where the similarities and differences lie.
Good, yeah. Well, more to say on that, I guess, but I think Vincent Davos-Saint-Pierre had a question on a slightly different topic.
Yes, first, do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me well? Yes, great. So I have a question about the relation between wonder and hope as passions that may be useful for scientific investigations. So one thing that I find interesting about wonder is that it is a passion that raises our awareness, that makes science interesting. Wonder may make science something exciting, but it can be misleading because I take for granted that the scientific investigation in Descartes is its object has to be something that is useful. Something that is useful. It's not only knowledge. We are looking for things that are useful knowledge. And one, I think, key difference between hope and wonder is that hope is it attaches us to something that is useful, where wonder attaches us to something that is new or strange, or something that is and in that way it can be misleading because it attaches us to things that may be interesting but not useful. So most of you have talked about wonder as being something that interests scientific investigation, and I think yes, I'm just wondering because I'm just wondering if any of you thought about this, about the difference between hope and wonder, because it seems to me that hope may be a much more useful passion for scientific investigation than wonder. That's it.
Open that to the panel in general, I guess.
Okay, I can kick off. Thank you for your question. That is interesting. I suppose that I would say that wonder for Descartes does have a kind of practical significance in that it sort of energizes us. It leads us to contemplate things and to reflect, pay our attention to things, and therefore kind of attain this this knowledge that we are after. And so I do think that it I think there's a sense in which all of the passions have a kind of practical impact for Descartes. Hope, I suppose, I'm trying to sort of remember off the top of my head. Hope is always going to be future directed. And so I suppose one difference for Descartes at least is that wonder might occupy our attention sort of in the moment, whereas hope is something that's it's always going to be directed at something in the future. That is one thing that he says. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I have a very small thing to add. It's very small. But I think that for Malebranche, because wonder kind of pushes us to constantly seek out new objects, because we're kind of seeking to satisfy the restlessness of the will, he does say that the hope that we have that these future objects will satisfy our restlessness actually kind of infects our assessment of them and leads us to find them sort of better than they really are. So when we hear about something kind of novel and extraordinary, he says, we get up great hope that this is the thing that we've been searching for, that this is kind of what's going to still our restlessness. And so I think he says, men normally flatter themselves and willingly believe that things are as they wish them to be, and their hopes are strengthened in proportion as their desires are increased. And so they sort of just assure themselves that what they found is what they were ultimately searching for because they were so hopeful. It's not a big point, but I think he does think that they kind of work together to derail us, I suppose, rather than doing something useful.
And could I just come in on the back of that to say that it seems that the way that Spinoza thinks that affects work and work together would lead him down a very similar route to Malebranche. So Spinoza says he talks about wonder combined with other passions, but not all of them. But of wonder combined with fear, for example, he says that the fear of the evil keeps one in suspense. So in a sense, the wonder and the fear are feeding off each other in a very unproductive way. And it seems like the same danger might be present in a slightly different way with hope. So Spinoza is quite negative about hope anyway. It's the sort of passion or affect that makes us very manipulable, particularly in the political context. But in the context of scientific inquiry, one might think that there's a danger that wonder combined with hope might have this, as Gabby said, this kind of overestimation of the value of what we're wondering at in our investigations.
All right, well, there's a few more minutes if anybody has any final thoughts or points. There's still lots of things, balls in the air. Well, if not, then let's please thank our wondrous panel again, and thank you to all of you. What a great discussion, set of questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you all for a wonderful, wonderful session. And hopefully we'll see you back next week.
Bye.